3:44 a.m. Philippine Sea Standard Time. The Philippine Sea east of the Luzon Strait runs deep, 5,000 meters in the Philippine Basin, cold and acoustically complex in ways that make both submarine and surface operations more demanding than the shallower waters of the South China Sea to the west. On this morning, it held two carrier strike groups on converging headings, separated by 340 nautical miles and closing at a combined rate of 52 knots. At that closure rate, 340 nautical miles dissolved in approximately 6.5 hours. Both commanding admirals had been calculating that figure since their respective groups had been placed on convergent courses 22 hours earlier. The U.S. Carrier Strike Group was eastbound, having transited the Luzon Strait after completing operations in the South China Sea. The Shandong Carrier Strike Group, the People's Liberation Army Navy's second commissioned carrier, an upgraded derivative of the Soviet Kuznetsov design, operating a wing of J-15 carrier-based fighters supplemented by J-35 fifth-generation aircraft that had achieved initial operational capability on the Shandong 6 months earlier, was westbound on a course from its operating area north of the Marianas. Both groups had been aware of each other's position since satellite imagery, and signals intelligence had established the convergence geometry at 2 a.m. Neither group had been ordered to divert. Neither had been ordered to close. The convergence was the operational situation that both commands were managing, not creating. What had created it was the strategic signaling competition of the preceding 72 hours. Both governments demonstrating resolve through carrier positioning in the Philippine Sea, both naval commands following orders that placed their groups on courses whose intersection was a consequence of the strategic signaling, not its purpose. Purpose and consequence had arrived at the same coordinates. The Philippine Sea's strategic geometry had made this convergence increasingly likely over the preceding 18 months. Both navies had been operating carrier groups in these waters with a frequency that had increased by 340% compared to the 3 years before the Taiwan Strait tensions had elevated to their current level. The density of carrier operations in a defined operating area was itself an escalation metric. More carriers meant more opportunities for close approaches. More close approaches meant more opportunities for events like the one developing between 3 a.m. and 3:44 a.m. And the accumulated risk of those events had been assessed, briefed, and accepted by both governments as a consequence of the signaling value they assigned to carrier presence. Both sides had decided the signaling value was worth the risk. At 3:44 a.m., both sides encountered the risk they had accepted. At 3:44 a.m., the convergence produced its first kinetic event. The plan's Shandong Strike Group had launched a 4-aircraft J-15 patrol at 3 a.m. on a forward reconnaissance mission that placed the aircraft 160 nautical miles ahead of the Shandong, well within the outer range of the F-35C combat air patrol that the U.S. carrier had been maintaining since midnight. The J-15 patrol's stated purpose was maritime reconnaissance. Its actual purpose was collection of the U.S. carrier group's radar emission profile, communications pattern, and formation geometry from a range close enough to be tactically valuable and far enough to be diplomatically ambiguous. The F-35C Combat Air Patrol acquired the J-15 formation at 160 nautical miles on passive sensor fusion at 3:12 a.m. The patrol lead transmitted the contact report to the carrier's Tactical Air Control Center at 3:13 a.m. The TACC assessed the J-15 formation's approach geometry as consistent with a collection profile rather than a weapons employment profile. The J-15s were flying level, at medium altitude, without the maneuver signatures associated with attack preparation. The TACC transmitted the assessment and received authorization to maintain a defensive intercept posture without provocation. The F-35C patrol closed to 60 nautical miles and established a parallel course to the J-15 formation at 3:19 a.m. 60 nautical miles was inside the PL-15 air-to-air missiles assessed engagement range. Both parties knew this. The F-35Cs were inside the J-15S weapons envelope. The J-15S were inside the AIM 120DS weapons envelope. The mutual weapons envelope overlap at 60 nautical miles was the geometry of the Philippine Sea at 3:19 a.m. At 3:44 a.m., one J-15 activated its active radar in a mode that the F-35C's electronic warfare system classified as weapons guidance illumination rather than search radar. The distinction between a fire control radar in search mode and a fire control radar in weapons guidance mode was the technical line between reconnaissance and weapons employment. The J-15 pilot may have activated the wrong mode in a moment of procedural error. He may have been ordered to activate it as a deliberate escalation step. The distinction was operationally irrelevant at 3:44 a.m. because the F-35C's onboard systems classified it as a weapons guidance illumination and transmitted a threat warning to the carrier at the speed of the data link. The U.S. Carrier Group's commander received the threat warning at 3:44 a.m. and 22 seconds. His pre-authorized rules of engagement covered weapons guidance illumination as an imminent threat requiring defensive response. He authorized defensive engagement at 3:44 a.m. and 41 seconds, 19 seconds after the threat warning. The F-35C patrol lead released two AIM 120D missiles at the illuminating J-15 at 3:44 a.m. and 44 seconds. The J-15 pilot detected the AIM 120D launch warning on his radar warning receiver at 3:44 a.m. and 49 seconds, 5 seconds after release. He broke hard right and began his defensive maneuver sequence. Maximum thrust, dispensing chaff and flares, activating his onboard jamming. His wingmen simultaneously broke in divergent directions to separate the formation and prevent the second AIM 120D from acquiring a clean solution against a formation target. The first AIM 120D tracked the illuminating J-15 through its defensive maneuver, its active seeker maintaining lock through the chaff dispensing because the J-15's radar cross-section, not reduced by any low observable treatment, was a dominant return against the chaff background. At 3:45 a.m., the first AIM 120D achieved proximity detonation parameters. The J-15 sustained significant fragmentation damage to its port wing and engine nacelle. The pilot transmitted a status report: aircraft controllable, weapons system non-functional, returning to Shandong. The second AIM 120D tracked the wingman J-15 that had broken right. The wingman's PL-12 air-to-air missile was already in flight. The wingman had not waited for the F-35C to fire. He had released on the F-35C patrol lead at 3:44 a.m. and 51 seconds, 7 seconds after the AIM 120D launch, in a simultaneous escalation that had no pause for de-confliction. Two weapons in the air from two directions. The PL-12 tracked the F-35C patrol lead through its reduced radar cross-section, its guidance algorithm working harder than it was designed to work against a target that barely existed in the radar picture. The PL-12's seeker lost lock at 3:45 a.m. and 9 seconds, insufficient radar return for terminal phase guidance. The missile passed 340 meters above and to the left of the F-35C without detonating. The second AIM 120D impacted the wingman J-15 at 3:45 a.m. and 22 seconds. The aircraft sustained catastrophic structural damage. The pilot ejected. Two J-15S engaged. One damaged, returning to Shandong. One non-operational, pilot in the water. Two remaining J-15S in the patrol, now 140 nautical miles from the Shandong, in an airspace that had been transformed in 41 seconds from a collection mission into an active air engagement. The carrier strike group commanders on both sides received the engagement results simultaneously at 3:46 a.m. Both transmitted flash precedence reports to their respective commands. Both received hold-fire orders at 3:47 a.m., 1 minute after the engagement completed. The hold-fire orders were not yet relevant to the immediate tactical situation. No further weapons had been released. Both surviving J-15s were in a defensive egress profile heading west. The F-35C patrol was holding its position. The hold-fire orders caught a situation that had already reached its own tactical pause. What they had not stopped was the operational machinery that the engagement had set in motion on both sides. The Shandong's commanding officer had been on his bridge since 3:30 a.m. At 3:47 a.m., he had two facts. One of his aircraft was in the water and its pilot was floating in the Philippine Sea, 140 nautical miles east of his carrier, and the engagement had been initiated by a U.S. weapons release following what his own tactical picture described as a J-15 radar emission in search mode, not weapons guidance mode. The distinction his tactical picture showed was different from the distinction the F-35C's electronic warfare system had classified. Both were assessments. Neither was ground truth. Both governments were now operating on different factual foundations for the same event. The J-15 pilot in the water had an emergency beacon. The Shandong's combat search and rescue helicopter was airborne by 3:49 a.m., 2 minutes after the engagement ended. Its transit time to the pilot's beacon position was 41 minutes. During those 41 minutes, the helicopter would be 140 nautical miles east of the Shandong, in airspace that was also 200 nautical miles west of the U.S. carrier. The SAR helicopter was unarmed. It was flying toward a downed pilot. The rules of engagement on both sides covered SAR operations. Neither side would engage an unarmed helicopter conducting a SAR operation. But both sides were watching it on radar, and both sides knew that the 200-mile convergence point between a Chinese SAR helicopter and a U.S. carrier strike group was a navigational fact that neither command could afford to ignore. The U.S. carrier's TACC tracked the Shandong SAR helicopter from its launch at 3:49 a.m. Its course, altitude, and IFF transponder all confirmed it as a SAR asset. The TACC logged it and transmitted the track to the carrier group commander. The commander noted it and requested guidance from Indopacom on SAR corridor protocols. Indopacom's response at 3:52 a.m. established a 50 nautical mile radius around the downed pilot's beacon as a mutual no-engagement zone for the SAR operation. The response had been coordinated through the emergency de-confliction channel with the plan's Pacific Fleet Command in a 4-minute exchange that was the fastest bilateral military communication since the hotline protocols had been established. 4 minutes to establish a mutual SAR corridor in the middle of a live air engagement aftermath. The protocol existed. Both sides used it. Both sides understood that using it was not a concession. It was the minimum coordination required to prevent a SAR helicopter from becoming the second kinetic event of the morning. The broader situation required more than SAR corridor protocols. The Shandong Strike Group's J-35 complement, the fifth-generation aircraft that represented the plan's most capable carrier-borne platform, had been on deck alert since 3 a.m. By 3:50 a.m., 4 J-35s were airborne, climbing to combat altitude on a course that was simultaneously a defensive CAPI posture for the Shandong and an approach toward the engagement area. The J-35's low observable design made its approach less visible than a J-15 sortie, but the Shandong's radar emissions and the data link activity of the launch sequence were visible to the U.S. group's sensors. The carrier group commander knew the J-35s were airborne at 3:52 a.m. through sensor fusion rather than direct radar detection. The F-35C patrol was now opposite 4 J-35s at converging distances. 6th generation versus 5th generation. Both platforms reduced the radar cross-section calculation that governed standoff air combat to a domain where passive sensors and electronic warfare defined the engagement geometry more than active radar. Both pilots' training had prepared them for this environment. Neither set of pilots had engaged the other in actual combat. Nobody had. This was the first time in the history of military aviation that two operational fleets of fifth-generation carrier aircraft were in the same airspace in an active post-engagement situation. The J-35's developmental program had been observed closely by the U.S. Navy's intelligence architecture since its carrier qualification trials 18 months earlier. Its radar cross-section, its sensor fusion architecture, and its weapons employment envelope had been assessed through a combination of electronic intelligence collection and the forensic analysis of the J-35's radar emissions during exercise operations. The assessment was confident on some parameters and uncertain on others. The F-35C pilots, who were now in the same airspace as four J-35s, knew which parameters were which. The uncertain ones were the ones that determined whether the F-35C's standoff engagement advantage held in a J-35 engagement or whether the J-35's own passive sensor capability reduced that advantage to something closer to parity. Nobody had. This was the first time in the history of military aviation that two operational fleets of fifth-generation carrier aircraft were in the same airspace in an active post-engagement situation. The hold-fire orders held. At 3:54 a.m., 10 minutes after the initial weapons release, no further weapons had been employed. The emergency de-confliction channel, which had been used for the SAR corridor protocol at 3:52 a.m., transmitted a second communication at 3:55 a.m. from the plan's Pacific Fleet Command to INDOPACOM. The communication requested an immediate cessation of all U.S. carrier air wing operations in the sector and the withdrawal of the carrier group from the immediate area. It characterized the initial AIM-120D release as an unprovoked attack on a reconnaissance flight in international airspace. INDOPACOM's response at 3:57 a.m. stated that the U.S. carrier group was operating in international airspace and international waters under full legal authority, that the AIM-120D release had followed a weapons guidance illumination of a U.S. military aircraft, and that the U.S. group would maintain its current position and operational posture. It requested a joint incident assessment through existing bilateral military communication channels. The request for a joint incident assessment was the diplomatic instrument for de-escalation, in a situation where both sides had incompatible factual accounts of the triggering event. The incompatibility was not a matter of one side lying and the other telling the truth. Both sides' sensors had recorded their classifications in real time, logged with timestamps, processed through algorithms that had been validated against known emitter libraries. The F-35C's electronic warfare system had classified the J-15's radar emission as weapons guidance mode based on a frequency hopping pattern and a pulse repetition interval that matched its threat library's weapons guidance template for the J-15's PL-12 fire control sequence. The J-15's own systems had been in a search mode whose frequency parameters overlapped with the weapon's guidance band at certain scan angles. The overlap existed. The threat library classification was technically defensible. Whether it was operationally accurate was a question that required access to both sides' electronic warfare logs simultaneously, something that had never been done in the history of U.S.-China military interaction. The request for a joint incident assessment was the diplomatic instrument for de-escalation in a situation where both sides had incompatible factual accounts of the triggering event. Both sides were reading their own electronic warfare logs. Neither side's log was wrong. Each had recorded what its own sensors had classified, and the sensors had reached different conclusions about the same emission. The joint assessment would either resolve the discrepancy or establish that the discrepancy was irresolvable, either of which was a more stable operational situation than two carrier strike groups at 200 nautical miles separation, with J-35s in the air and a downed pilot between them. The Shandong SAR helicopter reached the downed J-15 pilot's beacon position at 4:30 a.m. The 41-minute transit had been tracked on U.S. radar throughout. The helicopter's acoustic signature, its navigation light pattern, and its IFF transponder code had all been consistent with the SAR configuration throughout its transit. It had not deviated from the direct route to the beacon position. It had not made any transmission on military tactical frequencies. The U.S. carrier group had maintained passive tracking without active radar illumination of the helicopter during the entire transit. A deliberate choice that avoided the ambiguity that active radar tracking might create for the Shandong's own sensor picture. The Shandong SAR helicopter reached the downed J-15 pilot's beacon position at 4:30 a.m. The pilot was in the water in a survival suit. He had been in the Philippine Sea for 45 minutes. The water temperature was 26 degrees Celsius. He was alive and conscious when the helicopter's rescue swimmer reached him. He was aboard the helicopter at 4:33 a.m. The helicopter turned west toward the Shandong at 4:33 a.m. At 4:35 a.m., 2 minutes after the pilot was recovered, the plan's Pacific Fleet Command transmitted through the de-confliction channel. SAR mission complete. All aircraft returning to operating area. Requesting cessation of active threat tracking of Shandong aircraft on recovery course. Indopacom's response at 4:36 a.m. acknowledged U.S. group maintaining current position, active threat tracking of Shandong aircraft cessation, confirmed while within SAR recovery corridor. The J-35s returned to the Shandong's deck at 4:41 a.m. The F-35C patrol maintained its position until 4:45 a.m. and then returned to the carrier on a standard recovery profile. By 4:47 a.m., 63 minutes after the initial weapons release, both carrier groups were at their respective positions, neither closing nor opening the range, both conducting normal flight deck operations at the reduced tempo appropriate for a post-incident situation where neither side had orders to escalate and neither had orders to withdraw. The Joint Incident Assessment request from Indopacom had been formally accepted by the plan's Pacific Fleet Command at 4:39 a.m. The assessment team from both sides would meet through video link at 8 a.m. They would review each side's electronic warfare logs of the J-15 radar emission at 3:44 a.m. They would reach a conclusion that the logs showed a genuine technical discrepancy that could not be resolved by either side's sensors alone. They would document the discrepancy. They would recommend enhanced identification protocols for carrier air patrol interactions in contested airspace. The recommendation would be forwarded to both governments. Whether both governments would implement it was a different question from whether both assessment teams had made it. Time from J-15. Radar activation to cessation of active air engagement. 41 seconds. Time from initial weapons release to SAR mission complete. 49 minutes. Time from SAR completion to return to pre-incident operating tempo. 14 minutes. Total incident duration, 63 minutes. Weapons employed, US F-35C, 2AIM 120D air-to-air missiles. Plan J-15, 1 PL-12 air-to-air missile. Results: 1 J-15 damaged, returning to Shandong under own power, weapon system non-functional. 1 J-15 non-operational. Pilot recovered by SAR at 4:33 a.m., alive. 1 PL-12 failed to acquire F-35C in terminal phase, no effects. Both US F-35Cs undamaged. Diplomatic actions. SAR corridor protocol established in 4 minutes via emergency de-confliction channel. Joint incident assessment accepted at 4:39 a.m. Assessment meeting scheduled for 8 a.m. Both carrier groups maintaining position, neither withdrawing nor closing. The Philippine Sea held 2 carrier strike groups at the same 340 nautical mile separation. It had held them at when the morning began. The distance between them had not changed in 63 minutes. What had changed was that one pilot was alive on the Shandong's flight deck who had been in the water. One J-15 was in a maintenance bay with fragmentation damage in its port wing, and both governments' electronic warfare logs of a single radar emission classified the same event in different modes. That discrepancy was in a folder being carried to a video conference at 8 a.m. How it was resolved, or how the unresolvability of it was managed, was the question on which the next 24 hours in the Philippine Sea would turn.